Fox News Podcasts presents the Bret Baier Podcast with Fox News chief political anchor Bret Baier.
President Trump marks 1 year since beginning his second term, having achieved much of his legislative agenda despite Democratic opposition. The president setting to put his agenda in the global spotlight as he heads to Davos, Switzerland, joining the largest ever U.S. delegation to the World Economic Forum. The trip coming as the administration faces renewed attention over Greenland, with the president raising the possibility of new tariffs tied to what he describes as U.S. security interests in the region. President Trump joined in the White House press briefing on Tuesday.
You said you're confident something's going to get worked out in Greenland, but Greenlanders have made it clear they don't want to be part of the U.S.
Well,
what gives the U.S. the right to take away that self-determination?
When I speak to them, I'm sure they'll be thrilled.
How far are you willing to go to acquire Greenland?
You'll find out.
Back at home, tensions between anti-ICE protesters and law enforcement continue to grow in Minnesota. Over the weekend in St. Paul, a group of demonstrators disrupted a church service to protest a pastor they say also serves as a local ICE official. The Justice Department opening a federal civil rights investigation into the incident, saying the disruption of a house of worship could violate federal law. Lots to discuss this week. Let's bring in our panel. Host of The Big Ben Show, Ben Domenech, Democratic strategist, host of The Richard Fowler Show, Richard Fowler, and Fox News chief congressional correspondent, Chad Pergram. Chad, Democrats and Republicans reacting to the push for Greenland as the president heads to Davos. He kind of defended his actions, saying it's a national security issue. When pressed, how far will you go to acquire Greenland? He said, you'll find out. How's that playing?
That reminded me a lot of the famous line by Pierre Trudeau, the former Canadian Prime Minister, the father of Justin Trudeau, when there was this insurrection in Ottawa in the Parliament buildings, and he rolled the tanks. And there was a reporter from the CBC who famously said, how far are you willing to go? And he said, just watch me. And that kind of became the cause célèbre around and the legacy around Pierre Trudeau. That was a very similar comment. Now, you might have certain people in the Republican Party, and there's some here and there. We heard from Ted Cruz, the Republican senator from Texas, who was making the case for Greenland. Eric Schmidt, the Republican senator from Missouri as well, who even questioned to some degree Greenland's, tie to Denmark, even dating back a couple of hundred years, who have been, full-throated there. But you've had some other people speaking up, and notably these are people who are retiring. You have Republican Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who said he thinks that the president is getting bad advice on Greenland. And you had Mitch McConnell, who did not mention the president by name in a pretty pointed speech last week. The former Senate Majority Leader say that he said, I don't understand what this desire is, what we get out of this with Greenland. Now, people agree it is a security issue, but just the fact that you had all of these mostly Democratic lawmakers, Tom Tillis, though, was among the Republicans who went to Denmark to meet with Danish officials a couple of days ago. They're trying to tamp this down, and every time they do, the president seems to fan the flames. And that's going to be a problem potentially for Republicans in the midterms if you have this conversation always being about foreign policy. We're going to go to Iran. We're doing Venezuela this week, Greenland next week. And Republicans are out trying to get some traction on a bill to deal with affordability. That is a challenge for the GOP. They would rather talk about kitchen table issues and not Greenland, something which they view, most of them, a little bit far afield.
Yeah, I don't think that there's a doubt, Ben, about the national security implications and possibilities with Greenland, setting up the Golden Dome, the missile defense system up there has strategic value. But how it's happening is in question. And this could be Donald Trump, the president, in a negotiating style that, he stirs up all the pot and then gets all these guys to the table and they make a deal. Denmark's essentially saying you can do what you want.
I think that there's so many things that seem to start with a Truth Social post and then get taken seriously only after the president doubles down on them. And I think in this case, he certainly has. And in doing so, he has really roiled a lot of the relations that we have with our European allies in a lot of ways that I think could bear some negative fruit if they continue in the direction that they are. But as you say, this is a negotiating posture, and I think that that's what we have to view this through. the security questions, as you say, are just not debatable at this point. And you also, of course, have the enormous resources that are available within Greenland. But there were a lot of different ways, I think, that you could have come to some sort of solution prior to this, whether you entered into a new agreement on securities. I mean, the simple fact is that we have an agreement that basically dates back to 1951 that could use some updating when it comes to the security interests of the United States in that area. I think you could also see a situation where a joint sovereignty agreement through a condominium would be something that would be an option. But instead of that, I think that we've had a lot of bluster from Europe, and that the president has responded in kind, as he is wont to do. Look, whether this is going to be something that ultimately disrupts Republican chances in the midterms by having too much of a focus on foreign policy is something that I think does matter. Capitol Hill Republicans at this point are actually feeling much better than they were even 6 months ago, both about the economy, about the direction things are headed, about the fact you're going to have these tax refunds flowing out in such a significant degree. They do not think that these midterms are a foregone conclusion, despite the historical record and despite the fact that there are so many retirements involved. But I do think that something that could become a significant factor here is that the president isn't on the ballot. And because of that, he's focused more on all of these dream big issues that he has for his second term, which, whether you agree with them or not, have his eye more and more focused on the international stage, perhaps, than at home. And the fact that he's willing to deploy his favorite tool, tariffs, against against folks over in Europe in a way that, again, has them going into Davos with their hair on fire, is something that I think is par for the course when it comes to his relations with these allies around the world. And that's something that, again, is risky when you want to be talking about the kitchen table issues that Chad made reference to.
Yeah, and the tariff issue could be decided one way or another by the U.S. Supreme Court. We were expecting possibly a ruling today. Haven't gotten it. But
very interesting that we haven't gotten that yet, isn't it, Brett?
I agree. Richard, they started the news conference today at the White House with a reciting kind of the wish that the focus would be on ICE actions to take criminals off the streets. And then he went through this long stack of murderers and rapists and others just from Minnesota, holding up pictures, reading the specific convictions, and talking about the people taken off the streets. Is it possible that this issue is not being tracked accurately as far as what people care about across the country? If you look at the Wall Street Journal poll, for example, immigration, Republicans win over Democrats pretty significantly, at least in that one poll.
I think it's a very interesting issue because I think there's so many different ways to look at it. And here's why I say that. I think if the issue was just closing the border, I do think the president can say yes. And I think we heard that in his press conference today. I closed the border and we've seen border crossing decrease. I think if the president was just running and say, listen, we promised that we'd go after those in this country that have committed some of the most heinous crimes, he has a case to make on that. I think wherein lies the problem for the president is when the American people, no matter where they live in the country, see National Guards on streets, when they see innocent Americans being dragged out their house in boxer shorts and robes, when they see, ICE agents at carpool lanes, or when there's, alleged incidences of ICE agents dropping tear gas near schools, people start to be alarmed by that. And I think for any White House, whether it's a Democratic White House or Republican White House, that type of imagery doesn't bode well when your party is up for a re-election and it's going to be a very tight election to keep the majority in the House. And I would say, I think the Democrats are very bullish on the Senate, but in the Senate as well. And I think when there are other competing issues like affordability, like what's happening in foreign policy, if immigration's your number one issue, you can't have images like that out there playing on the nightly evening news across the country.
Chad, what do you think of that?
I think that's an issue. You talk to some Republicans and they say, okay, they generally agree with the idea and the president's success on the border. When it gets into some of this video, though, and some of these tactics by ICE that might be perceived as too aggressive. But, that's maybe why the president was going through chapter and verse and talking about, this rogues gallery of people who they picked up in Minnesota, bringing it back to the idea that there are bad people out there, that ICE does have a responsibility. And I should note that the Homeland Security spending bill, which funds ICE, which came out in the wee hours of this morning, and will probably be voted in the House of Representatives on Thursday and likely will pass, we think, with a bipartisan coalition of some Democrats and lots of Republicans, really didn't put any guardrails on DHS. There's a few things there, but it's not much. Some body cams, it's not very much. And Democrats talked repeatedly about the power of the purse, leverage, there's that word again we heard this fall, of using this inflection point moment to try to address a crisis and make good with their base. There is the potential that as we go into this next funding round in the next week or so here, they have to fund these sections of the federal government by the 30th of January, including DHS, that the Democratic liberal base might not see the leadership as fighting hard enough. And it's been very interesting, and I've reported on your show a couple of times and elsewhere over the past 2 weeks, that when we have confronted Chuck Schumer and confronted Hakeem Jeffries, they have been very elliptical in their answers here because they don't want to disturb this kind of semi-fragile truce on appropriations and stumble into yet another government shutdown. Now, does that set well with the base? We don't know. And then the other issue is how do people in the middle, and certainly on the Republican side, who maybe the Democrats are trying to court this fall, does that resonate with them in any way? And maybe the case that the president is making, that we are making headway. This is part of dealing with the border. But do those images, violent images, weigh out in the court of public opinion? That we just don't know yet. As long as they're talking about border enforcement, that seems to work, but some of this other stuff that we've gotten into in Minnesota might not work as well as some on the Republican side would like.
All right, we're going to take a quick pause here. We'll be back after this. Understanding we've kind of felt the 43 days of government shutdown before and what that means on Capitol Hill, what do you put the chances are on, Chad, that January 31st is another fiscal cliff that we face?
Yeah, about 20%. I don't put it in the low teens or the single digits. You got to remember that this is most of federal government funding, because included in this package is funding for the Pentagon, and that's about 55% of all appropriations bills that Congress moves each year, and then you put DHS on top of that and everything else. So, this is a big chunk of probably pushing about 70% of all federal funding. I don't think either side wants a shutdown at all. But, you get some comments from Chris Murphy, who's the Democratic senator from Connecticut, and he's the top Democrat on the Homeland Security Appropriations panel in the Senate, and he is rather sketch on this. So let's say they get it through the House. You don't know what happens in the Senate. Why? Because you have to get 60 votes. It's about the math, and that means they have to get some Democrats involved, and there's probably a Republican or two who might vote no.
Yeah, and Ben, I always caution people that we're still in January. We have a long, long way to go to November. And for all the people like James Carville and others who say this is going to be a blowout, Democrats are going to win everything, there's a lot of time. There's Q1, Q2.
Yeah, there is a lot of time. And I think that this is not – we've seen sort of such a shift in the American political makeup in terms of the voting base that Republicans depend on and Democrats depend on. And it's a shift that I think we're still figuring out in terms of the way it's going to play out going forward. And keep in mind, this is the first, election that we really have where, the Trump presidency is locked in, but this is kind of about the future. What does that look like? And the other thing that I think we should keep in mind is that I'm not sure that the immigration issue and that the ICE issue plays exactly the way that national figures are necessarily assuming that it does. The very first act that Abigail Spanberger did when she took over the governorship here in Virginia was to reverse Glenn Youngkin's executive order requiring that state police work with ICE when it comes to arresting and deporting illegal immigrants with criminal records.
With criminal records. That's like the part of the deal.
Yeah, she got plaudits for that, obviously, from all the normal sources. So what happens when something inevitably happens with someone who is an illegal immigrant with a criminal record, and that becomes a news story? This is not the kind of situation where those consequences don't matter. There is an issue. There is a reason that you see those poll numbers that you mentioned, Brett, and I just do not believe that that this is as much of a one-sided issue as the national media seems to continue to frame it. Now, that being said, I do think that Republicans need to focus on their priorities and not take their eye off the ball, and they shouldn't give in to some kind of idea that they can't be talking about the things that Americans are talking about and concerned about going forward. I think that's one of the reasons the president emphasized so much the movement on gas prices that we're seeing, that he is leaning as much as he possibly can into silver linings in the economy that he wants Republicans to be talking more about, as opposed to getting caught up in normal Washington mishigas. And that's going to be critical, I think, if they're going to buck historical trends.
Yeah. Richard, you know, what happens if, and I've heard this a couple of times from the president, including at the press conference today, saying he doesn't want to go after the hardworking farm workers who are just doing their job. And in an interview with the New York Times, he said, well, if Democrats come up with something good, I could consider something. What happens if, in the State of the Union address, the president says anybody who's been here since before 2020 and has been part of the community or paying taxes, we're going to get you a pathway to citizenship, and we're going to do the Dreamers because I closed the border. What happens if he does that? Does it change the whole dynamic for Democrats?
I think he has a problem. He has a problem with Josh Hawley in the United States Senate, but that's I'm a guessing man. But I do think that he will have support from Democrats to do that, because in a way, what the president has done by closing the border is he's fundamentally taken a large chunk of the immigration issue off the table for Democrats.
Yeah.
Democrats can just focus on ICE enforcement, and talk about that and not talk about the border, which they don't want to talk about anyway. And I think coupled to that, I think where I think time works against this president in this moment is we're now living in an era where we're seeing higher than normal healthcare premiums. And I think it's a story that we're not covering as well as we should. But those 15,000 nurses that are striking in New York City for higher wages, as we see Medicaid cuts that will likely start to sort of bear fruit this time next year, that's going to be the scene in a lot of other hospitals across the country, and a lot of red states as well. And so I think the Republicans are going to have to figure out how they want to talk about health care. I think health care will be a bigger issue in this midterm election than the immigration issue will, as more and more folks will be dealing with their new health care bills and the closure of hospitals across the country.
Yeah. Chad, the purpose of me asking that question is that there are a number of long ball moves that could come that change the dynamic immensely.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's where, I always talk about events. It's not me talking about this. This was Harold Macmillan, who was the British Prime Minister. You've heard me use this quote before. Events are the most important factor in politics. We don't know what's going to happen in Iran. We don't know, what the response to the markets might fully be on the tariff question. We don't know what might happen in Venezuela. We don't know the Greenland issue, if the president is that determined on this, and maybe the Europeans push back. There are so many different factors between now and the midterms. You don't know if Republicans in Congress can pass another mega bill. They're talking about something to deal with, quote, affordability. They don't have great numbers right now in the House of Representatives, certainly to move something. They would probably have to use the special budget process, reconciliation, to go around a filibuster in the Senate. They've done that a couple of times already this Congress, and that is an absolute slog in the Senate. It's one thing maybe to get it done before the end of the Congress. It's another thing to get it done before the midterms, maybe get it done in August or something, and especially because they're talking about health care, which is the radioactive issue on Capitol Hill that everybody always talks about and they can never solve. Do they get any bang for their buck even doing that? Republicans have said that it's been a little bit hard to market the big, beautiful bill. And, some people have said maybe they should just focus on marketing that and not putting their nose to the grindstone. And don't forget, about 5 weeks before the midterms, what do they have to do again? Fund the government. To heck with this funding deadline here at the end of the month. We could be in another crisis there, depending on which ways the political winds blow.
Always fun, guys. Thank you very much. Now for a bit of history. On January 24th, 1972, two hunters in Guam discovered Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi, a Japanese soldier who had been hiding in the jungle since World War II. Yokoi was deployed to Guam in 1944. After U.S. forces captured the island, Japanese command collapsed, and he was left behind. Believing the war was still going on, Yokoi remained in hiding for nearly 28 years. A tailor by trade, he survived by weaving his own clothing and living off shrimp, toads, and scavenged food. He possessed little more than basic supplies and a rusted rifle. Yokoi was returned to Japan, where he later wrote about his experience and lived quietly until his death at age 82. There you go. That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download your favorite podcast. Make sure to leave a rating and a review. We want to hear from you. For Ben, Richard, and Chad, I'm Brett Baer. We'll see you next time. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.